Hi guys, and welcome back to HTP Story Time. Tonight we will hear some famous cases of criminals surviving their execution. It is no surprise that with all the hangings the Elizabethan court system got through, there are bound to be more than a few bungles between them. But as these public executions continued, gradually society spoke up, and an end came to the severe justice being meted out to men, women, and even children of the time. This eventually led to the creation of our modern police force and our modern justice system, which affected both the criminal and the civil systems. All for the better, in my opinion. So let's finish up this chapter that started out talking about the evils of jinn, but spent most of its pages talking of the evils of man. Let's go. Okay, before we cease to speak of Tyburn, it might be mentioned that there were a number of cases in which hanged people were revived. The most famous was of a 16-year-old youth, William Dewell, who in 1740 arred and murdered a girl in a barn. After he had been cut down and taken to the surgeon's hall for dissection, he began to move. The surgeon bled him, and half an hour later Dewell sat up. Since the sentence of hanging had been carried out, he could not be hanged again. Instead, he was transported for life. Anne Greene was a servant girl who was found guilty of killing her newly born baby. Her friends hung on her legs to try to put her out of her misery more quickly. One can only presume the rope was badly tied, and when she was cut down and still twitched, one of them jumped on her stomach, and a soldier hit her in the head with his musket. In the surgeon's hall, a rattling was heard in her throat, and she was put into a warm bed. The next day she was almost fully recovered. She died in 1659, 9 years after her hanging, during which time she had married and had 3 children. In 1728, a girl named Margaret Dixon established the basis of a lifelong reputation by hanging for an hour and then being taken away in her coffin. Knocking noises were heard from inside the coffin, at which everyone fled. But someone had the courage to return and take her out. She not only recovered, but had to marry her husband a second time, since she was legally dead and her marriage therefore dissolved. Her murder of her baby had also been the result of the kidnapping of her husband by a press gang. Under the name of Hanged Meg, she was still a notable public figure in Edinburgh 25 years later. Hanged Smith was a horsebreaker who was hanged at Tyburn. After 5 minutes, some merrymakers in the crowd began to shout, "A reprieve!" as if a man had arrived waving a document. The executioner cut him down and he revived at a nearby house. Later he described his sensations. "I felt a very great pain caused by the weight of my body, and my spirits felt in a strange commotion, violently pressing upwards. They forced their way into my head, and then I saw a great blaze of glaring light which seemed to go out of my eyes with a flash. After that I lost all sense of pain until I was cut down, when I experienced an intolerable pricking or shooting. The latter obviously the pins and needles that comes when blood returns to a part of the body from which it had been cut off. This was in 1705. How crazy is that? And you have no idea what pins and needles are and then experience it for the first time, directly after a hanging. You'd think that was the flames of hell heating up your old body there. Okay. Towards the last part of the century, there was a gradual change in public opinion towards violence. Tyburn Gallows was removed because it hindered traffic, but also because these spectacles were beginning to offend people. This should not be taken to mean the ordinary people who seemed to feel no sympathy for the criminal and enjoyed the hangings in the way that schoolboys enjoy seeing other schoolboys being caned. The crowds who threw things at Elizabeth Brownrigg in 1767 were not horrified by her cruelty. It was simply a demonstration by the underdog against the, quote, middle classes, end quote, who could beat and starve them. No, the change in sensibility was taking place in the educated classes, and it was the result of increased national prosperity and the gradual relaxation of religious bigotry. The Newgate calendar contains an interesting example of this change of sensibility in the chapter on Thomas Colley, hanged in 1751 for drowning a woman believed to be a witch. Colley was the ringleader of a mob who seized an old couple called Osborne from the workhouse. They were believed to be a witch and a wizard. Both were stripped and ducked in a pond. Colley kept pushing them under with a long stick. The woman died with her mouth and nose choked with mud. Wilkinson's account declares indignantly, quote, "It is astonishing to believe that any persons could be so stupid as to believe in the ridiculous doctrine of witchcraft," end quote, and goes on to offer several pages of cases from the past of witches being forced to confess by torture. One realizes with mild amazement that Wilkinson felt he was living in a rational and enlightened age, and that all this barbarity was behind him. In fact, it would be more than 50 more years before there was an attempt to introduce even such simple reforms as preventing children from working down mines or being forced to climb chimneys as sweeps, to preventing landowners from setting man-traps and spring guns, and passing safety regulations to prevent ships from being grossly overloaded. But at least the age of Dr. Johnson, who supported public hanging, because he thought it deterred criminals, was giving way to the age of William Blake and Wordsworth. Blake's early poems, full of pity for children forced to sweep chimneys and girls forced into prostitution, date from the same time as the Newgate calendar. The man who was chiefly responsible for a new attitude towards crime in London was the novelist Henry Fielding, who became a magistrate in 1748. After he had failed to make a living as a playwright. Before Fielding, the law attempted to repress crime by the savagery of the sentences and by gibbets and dissection. Fielding was the first to make a simple and obvious suggestion: why not try to prevent crime in advance by having an efficient police force? This struck the government as a wildly illogical proposal. After all, each parish employed its constables and watchmen. Fielding's predecessor at Bow Street had been Sir Thomas Dewell, a good magistrate by all ordinary standards, although he boasted of making £1,000 a year by, quote, trading justice, end quote. He was also a satyr who shamelessly used his office to procure himself, quote, a great variety of young ladies, end quote. Fielding's kind of honesty and dedication was regarded as slightly insane, and after 6 years of struggling against the government, he died. But he had created the core of a small army of efficient policemen in Bow Street. His blind half-brother, John, carried on his work, and the Bow Street runners became famous for their efficiency. In 1785, the new Prime Minister, Mr. Pitt, introduced a police bill that represented the final triumph of Henry Fielding's proposal. By the year 1800, there were 9 police officers in London, and the century-long crime wave was at last over.